So welcome everyone. I'm Xander Willoughby. I'm the Communications Officer for ConnexUs here at Search for Common Ground. I'm really excited for today's Thursday Talk. As I hope all of you know by now, we've been in the midst of a knowledge sharing campaign with USAID on climate security, creating opportunities for discussion, sharing best practices, lessons learned, resources, events, discussions, all of that over the last few months. And we're really excited today for our last Thursday Talk in this series. And Daniel, I'll hand it over to you to set the stage and moderate the discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Xander. And thank you for all the work you've done on this campaign. So as mentioned, my name is Daniel Abrahams. I serve as the Senior Climate Security Advisor in USAID Center for Violence Prevention, which is a technical hub within the Conflict Prevention and Stabilization Bureau. I want to start really, again, reiterating my thanks to the ConnexUs team, Xander and Emily in particular, and the folks at USAID, Nicole, Lena, Essie in particular, who have been working so diligently behind the scenes. They all deserve a real virtual round of applause. I'm going to keep my comments really brief because I want to hand it over to Beza and give her as much time and give the audience as much time so we can field your questions. As we discussed in a previous talk, focused on the recent release of USAID's Land in Conflict, Water in Conflict, and forthcoming Feed the Future in Conflict toolkits, the climate security space is really at an inflection point. We are shifting away from an emphasis on the problem and towards developing a suite of solutions. And as Beza is going to discuss with us, those solutions inevitably need to balance feasibility and impact and conflict sensitivity. And there are, quite frankly, nothing even close to resembling a silver bullet. And when we think about the combination of challenges as it relates to climate change and conflict, we're going to have to manage uncertainty to some degree. Meaning that every decision and every throughput that we have in this space is going to be important and significant. The timeframes, the climate projections, the different models we use, the sources of conflict data are fundamentally going to shape how we understand and ultimately intervene at the nexus of climate change and conflict and climate change and security. Furthermore, many of our tools are rooted in the development of us or the production and delivery of climate-related data as it relates to conflict to determine risk. All of that points to just how reliant this field is on data, proper data analysis, and the delivery of data-driven information. We are beholden to questions around data, which is what's driving this session, because we need to be really thoughtful about how we approach data and critically being willing to experiment and ready to learn. And that is why I'm really excited to have Beza here and talk about the work she's doing at Mercy Corps. The work she's going to discuss is data-driven, it's experimental, and it really shows how we can best use data when we are responding to joint climate security issues. And since Beza is our only presenter, my hope is that we're going to have plenty of time for your questions. So do jot those down, put them in the chat. I'll field them or raise a hand once she is done presenting. But with that, I'm going to hand it over to Beza and really look forward to this conversation.
Thank you, Daniel and Xander, and thank you everyone for joining. I'm really excited to be here. Let me just start by introducing myself while we get the PowerPoint ready. So I'm Beza Tesfaye. I'm a research and learning at Mercy Corps, where I have overseen some of our work on climate change, particularly our research related to climate migration and displacement, and a bit on climate security. The topic that I'll be presenting on is leveraging data to respond to climate challenges in fragile contexts. And I want to share a bit with you some of the work that we've been doing at Mercy Corps in this regard. And just to clarify, I'm presenting the work of several other folks at Mercy Corps, not just my own. Just want to acknowledge their contributions as well. It's really been a team effort, as well as some of our engagement with external partners and researchers. But over the years, we've really learned quite a lot from leveraging secondary data, primary data, and better understanding the dynamics between climate change and conflict, for example, but also more generally thinking about how to respond to climate challenges in fragile contexts. So I will do a relatively brief presentation where I wanted to start off by just giving an overview, setting the scene by talking a bit about things like sources of data that are available to us, ways in which we can use data in responding to climate change as practitioners, and then some of the caveats and limitations of some of the common sources and uses of data in our field. I'll talk about a couple of specific examples where we've applied data analysis in designing program approaches and responses from our work in different regions. And then we'll have a lot of time at the end for a discussion facilitated by Daniel around these topics. So to start off, again, just setting the scene a bit, when it comes to data, particularly those that we in the humanitarian and development sector rely on, there are many different sources, and I've categorized this into two common, buckets that we think about. One would be primary data, and this is, essentially data that we collect ourselves through our sort of presence on the ground. So it often takes the forms of things like surveys with our participants, communities that we serve. It can also be more qualitative data, interviews, in-depth interviews with either participants or even programmatic staff that are on the ground. There's also a set of output project data, so information that we gather around things that we're actually doing. This can include, for example, the number of boreholes rehabilitated in a certain project, or the number of agricultural outputs distributed, and so on. But generally, output level data that we collect. And then something that is sort of encompasses all of this, but can just generally be related to the fact that we're on the ground. So we have a lot of observations from our projects, from the fact that we are situated in the places that we're studying. So observational data of various sorts are also things that we collect. In addition to that, the other category of data that I've noted here is secondary data. So data that is collected by usually governments or other large organizations, which can still be useful for us as practitioners, and often accessible for us to use as well. There's very many different types of secondary data. I've just listed out a few of the common ones that we've used. So things like public opinion polls that tend to be more representative because they're conducted, across larger geographic areas. So you have groups like Afrobarometer, Arabarometer, Gallup, and others that conduct these types of polls. There's also administrative data from governments and organizations, larger organizations, which is extremely helpful. Things like population data, poverty and development statistics, and you can even think of, in the case of conflict, governments that collect things like court cases or police incidents. So a lot of information that can give you a sense of conflict dynamics as well. And then the last thing I have here, which I think is increasingly of interest and use for humanitarian organizations, is satellite data, which is essentially high resolution images of the Earth taken from satellites that orbit the Earth that are collected on a high frequency basis, sometimes even daily, and can allow us to derive indicators of things like vegetation, soil moisture, and other variables that are useful for studying environmental and climate factors. So all this to say, there are abundant number of sources of data at our disposal. Now, thinking about how we use that data, I've just listed out three common, ways of analyzing or thinking about using data, but there are others. Primarily, I think what we tend to do is kind of use data to describe a population, to describe a relationship or a trend, and this is often done through qualitative data or descriptive statistics. So this is essentially describing or descriptive analysis rather than explaining. That's the first category. The second one goes a step further, what we refer to as inferential analysis, inferential use of data. And here we're able to actually draw conclusions or make explanations based on a set of data that we've collected. The most common way that we do this is essentially draw a sample that is representative of a larger population. And based on that sample, we make inferences about the broader population. You can imagine, for example, if I drew a sample of the audience, a random sample, I could infer what the average age is in this group. So this is something very powerful and something that increasingly we do as practitioners. The third category, which is really interesting and powerful, is thinking about how we could actually use data to predict future trends. And this is done essentially by looking at historical data from the past and using statistical approaches to then, derive future trends. And this is where things like machine learning and AI come into the conversation. And this, of course, can be very powerful when it comes to making decision making for implementing organizations. So before going into the examples, I just wanted to give a few caveats about particularly the use of quantitative data and quantitative analysis for understanding things like the relationship between climate change and conflict and using that for programming purposes. And I make these caveats while also, still being a very big proponent of the use of data in our work. But it's important to be sort of honest about the challenges and limitations. One is that, I often see it as kind of a sort of limited view of a much bigger picture, kind of like seeing the surface of the iceberg. And this is particularly the case when it comes to complex, dynamics or relationships. And when we're trying to use quantitative data to explain these relationships, yeah, there's just a lot of unaccounted for factors that can affect the dynamics that we're looking at, which our quantitative statistical models might not fully account for. The second caveat is that even if we are able to use these tools and forms of analyses to identify some kind of dynamic or relationship between factors, like let's say between rainfall and conflict, we still have to interpret what that means. So knowing that a relationship exists is important, but then really understanding why there might be this dynamic is also important. And I think that goes beyond the scope of what these tools or what this analysis allows us to do sometimes. And then the third caveat, which I think everybody will know with any form of research and analysis, there are limits to generalizability, especially again with these types of complex relationships and dynamics. And what we might find in one context might not necessarily transfer to another. So yeah, it's just something to keep in mind in terms of the importance of contextualizing the findings that we have. So I'm going to go through a couple of examples now of how we've tried to apply data and data analysis in better refining our approaches and responses to climate change, including, some of the thinking we've been doing around climate and conflict in fragile contexts. So the first project that I want to talk about is based on some research that we did in 2020, where we were essentially trying to use quantitative data to better understand the relationship between climate change and conflict, and particularly what the leverage points are that could help mitigate the negative sort of impact that climate change may have on conflict. So in this project, we started by thinking about the underlying theories and drivers of and how climate change may multiply those drivers. As we all know, climate change is not a direct cause of conflict, but can, indirectly affect conflict through different drivers or channels. There's a huge literature on this topic, and I've just called out some of the sort of the key drivers of conflict and fragile contexts that we explored in terms of theory building for this project. There are obviously environmental stressors related to natural resources, particularly land, for example, that can drive context in fragile contexts. There's also governance, which comes up quite a lot, both as a driver when it comes to poor governance and also a mitigator when it comes to good governance. There are social cleavages along ethnic, religious lines, or generally intercommunal conflict that can also be a driver of violence. And finally, economic drivers related to, competition, levels of development, and lack of livelihood opportunities that also can affect conflict in fragile environments. So in this project, we were interested in understanding how climate variability might affect conflict, specifically through the mechanism of governance. That is, that we wanted to ask and answer, does good or poor governance mediate the relationship between climate variability and conflict? And if so, in what ways? So our analytical approach and what we tested was first really just trying to see if there was any kind of relationship or correlation between measures of climate variability and conflict, assuming this was, again, an indirect relationship, but if there was this actual relationship. And then if the interaction of climate variability and governance indicators would lead to any kind of a sort of change in that impact on conflict. So again, trying to see if governance can mediate this dynamic. So on the left-hand side, I've listed out some of the data sources that we used in this analysis, various sources of weather data, so particularly looking at temperature variability and precipitation variability. We also drew on ACLED data for conflict events and Afrobarometer surveys for indicators of governance. So this analysis covered 5 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, essentially Kenya, Nigeria, Uganda, Zimbabwe, and Mali. And as I mentioned, the first part of this was really just looking if there was any kind of relationship between the climate variables, precipitation and temperature, and conflict, and then looking at the sort of the second stage, which is when we interact governance with these variables, what are the impacts on conflict? And the table on the right summarizes the findings from this. So first, in terms of the relationship between precipitation and temperature variability and conflict, we find some support for a positive relationship when it comes to temperature. You can see that in the case of Nigeria and Uganda. But when it comes to precipitation, it was a bit mixed. So in some cases, precipitation variability is linked to more conflict. In some cases, it was linked to less conflict. And this was actually quite consistent with the literature that we had in the paper. The second stage, again, was looking at what was the additive effect of governance. And we looked specifically at indicators of government reach. So the government having a presence in terms of post offices or police stations, as well as their handling of corruption. And here you'll see that there is somewhat of a trend that the introduction of this governance variable leads to a reduction in the sort of the negative, the correlation between climate change and conflict. So the negative sign indicates that positive relationship is actually mitigated or reversed in a sense. So this was consistent with our theory again that governance can play a mediating force. But that being said, I think what is also clear is that there was quite a lot of variation across the 5 countries that we looked at, despite, us being able to pull out some general trends from this analysis. So because of some of the variations that we came across, we thought it would be interesting to look more locally, so at a subnational level, to better understand what the patterns of conflict might be within a specific country. So we did a bit of this analysis looking at Mali specifically. And the first thing that we tried to do was see if there might be any kind of seasonal or temporal patterns of conflict, as well as any kind of spatial patterns of conflict. So on the left, you'll see we mapped out incidences of conflict, again, using ACLED data for various years and looked at, the frequency of those incidences by month. And there was no ostensible patterns here. As you can see, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of variation in terms of seasonality, right? We expected perhaps that we might see more conflict during certain periods of the year where there might be more or less rainfall, but we didn't really observe this off the bat. So then we also tried to look at the spatial distribution of conflict, again, using ACLED data and then superimposing this on maps of Mali, which showed some of the the geographic features of the country. And I think the first thing you will notice is that a lot of the conflict does tend to be geographically concentrated, right? A lot of it is in the central and eastern part of the country. And when we zoomed in, for example, to central Mali, where Mercy Corps works a lot in terms of environmental peace building projects, we did see some interesting dynamics here. One of the things that we noticed on the right, this is sort of a zooming in of central Mali, is that when we looked at the sort of water bodies, like here specifically, you'll see the Niger River that runs through central Mali. There were incidences of conflict that are sort of dotted along the river itself, which we thought was an interesting observation. Of course, this can mean many different things. It could perhaps mean that there's conflict occurring around the use of water or access to water in the region. But it could also be that there's more conflict in these areas because populations are more highly concentrated closer to water bodies like the river. So again, a bit difficult to interpret without additional information, but we thought this was interesting to see that the distribution was closer to water bodies. So the last piece of analysis that we did was trying to actually look at relationships between various environmental variables and in Mali using a regression analysis. And a couple of the results that came up as being significant was the variables I've circled. So there were higher incidences or higher probability of conflict in grassland areas that are used for grazing. And then we also found that there's higher incidences of conflict in urban areas or more densely populated areas. So both of these are not surprising and largely consistent with what we knew about the situation in Mali. So to summarize what we learned from this is an example of doing inferential data analysis, is that this type of analysis can be useful for testing out some of our theories and helping us to better understand some of the relationships and dynamics. And of course, this could be helpful for practitioners in thinking about responses and approaches. For example, the need to strengthen governance as a way of mitigating the impact of climate change on conflict, or working in specific localities like grasslands that might be experiencing more climate-related violence or conflict. But again, the caveats are that the results tend to be highly context specific and localized. And as a result, it's very useful to have more granular subnational data to be able to look at these dynamics at a more local level. And similar to this, it would be very helpful to also have qualitative data or different forms of data to triangulate and confirm some of the information or conclusions that we want to make from the quantitative analysis. So I'm going to shift now to the second example, which is a way in which we can use data to actually inform decisions in our programming. And this is an ongoing project that we are implementing in the Central America region. And I have here a copy of an article that we recently published in IOM's Migration Policy Practice publication. Encourage everyone, if you can, to read that, as it gives a more detailed overview of the case study. Essentially, the project was trying to pilot a new service that encourages remittance senders in the US to send money back home to family members in Central America ahead of tropical cyclones. And the reason why we were doing this is because there's a lot of research indicating that investing in preventative or anticipatory action can help to mitigate the worst effects of climate disasters in fragile contexts. So this is sort of the motivation behind it. And our idea was to really help remittance providers leverage some of the climate and weather information and data that's available publicly, and to help them inform their clients of the risk of an impending disaster so that they can send money as a form of anticipatory action. So the pilot was designed in a way in which we could try to actually measure the impact of this type of service. And how we've sort of designed this pilot is that we undertake daily monitoring of climate and weather information and data, particularly tropical cyclone forecasts for the Central America region. And we assess if sort of a predefined trigger for anticipatory action is reached. And when that action is reached, we work with a remittance provider to help send notifications, information to clients, as well as a financial incentive, encouraging them to send money earlier so that their family members in Central America will have access to cash ahead of the storm. We are testing a set of hypotheses about how this type of intervention can help improve well-being outcomes by first changing years. So people that have the information and incentives will send more money, and they will send the money earlier ahead of a disaster. And if people receive this money, they'll be able to take action and as a result, improve their well-being outcomes. So reduce the impacts, the negative impacts of the disaster through the access to cash. So this is what the campaign looks like on the right. Essentially, our partner Remitly sends out these notifications once the trigger for anticipatory action has been reached. And to be able to assess whether that trigger has been reached, we have daily monitoring of different weather and data sources, including from NOAA, that is the source for tropical cyclone activity. And we also monitor data from local institutions, local disaster management, and meteorological institutions within specific countries like Guatemala. So once the trigger has been reached, this message is sent via app to clients, and then they're offered an incentive, a waiver on fees, or a discount so that they're encouraged to send money earlier. This is just a visual of what the daily monitoring looks like. It's basically on the left, we have a sort of a assessment of different indicators, which we routinely monitor. And once, a certain threshold has been met, then we notify clients. This is what the data looks like, essentially drawing on NOAA and information from the National Hurricane Center. So just to summarize, this is my last slide, but what we've taken away from this experience, this opportunity to use data for responses, is that, first of all, the information that we have, especially forecast information on weather and climate, allows us to make decisions and for anticipatory action. But there's always a trade-off between the level of certainty that we have in predictions and the time frame in which we would like to act. So if we want to act earlier, oftentimes the certainty and those predictions are lower. So that this is a very important dilemma or trade-off that we often face. Secondly, just to note that, even though there's a lot of information and data, there's still a need to have expert or sort of programmatic designers make a qualitative decision on what the trigger or threshold should be for any form of anticipatory action. Third, having access to various data sources is useful and not just one form. So in our case, we looked at not just tropical cyclone probability and path, but also things like the probability of sub-hazards related to landslides and flooding. And this helped us have a more holistic sense of the risk profile for specific geographies. And finally, as I mentioned, we were monitoring, the various data sources on a daily basis, which was helpful for how we designed this project. But we realized this is not very scalable. Having someone look at information daily is not a way in which we can scale this solution. So we're considering and thinking about ways in which we could automate the process of monitoring information and making the decisions. So that's it. I'm sorry I went a little bit over, but yeah, I want to turn it back over to you now, Daniel, and happy to take any questions if there are any clarifying questions, and then would love to get questions more generally about the topic.
Thank you, Beza. That was a really excellent presentation, and I took a lot from it and have many questions already coming in. But I think this is a perfect segue. I want to talk about the remittance example, because it underscores a lot of things that I think we're thinking about in aid, including how migration can be thought about as a means of adaptation, and how in this instance, sort of it can be leveraged not only in individuals, but in their families' own ability to adapt to climate change. In this case, by proactively being able to deal with the impacts. So I think for me, the first question just to get us going is if you could speak a little bit more about sort of the efficacy of that and some of the findings. And really, I think more generally, what you see as strategies and also challenges to developing and measuring interventions that span geographies and span sectors, because I think that example really takes us there. So thoughts on the efficacy and how we measure and understand interventions that go across geographies and sectors. And then I'll start taking questions from the audience after that.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the point around climate migration and adaptation. I think one of the reasons why we wanted to do this work around remittances is because I didn't mention it, but remittances are a huge source of income and support for basic needs and emergency needs in a lot of low income countries and in fragile contexts even, and they have sort of the ability to reach people in some cases even more effectively than humanitarian aid because of the prevalence and of transfer agencies and the reliance of communities on these resources. So the project did stem from that understanding that migration and the benefits of migration, including remittances, can support, in this case, disaster risk mitigation, and perhaps also thinking about adaptation in the long term. The project is complex and complicated, as you say, because it spans different geographies. We work with clients in the US and communities in Central America. So I think that's the nature of work when it comes to migration, just kind of thinking about the fact that mobility implies that we're looking at different geographies and we have to figure out ways to be comfortable working across, different geographies and sectors. Yeah, in terms of measurement and being able to assess the effectiveness of these approaches, it's very important, particularly with newer ideas, which is why we call this a pilot. We are just testing this out, designing this for the first time. But we also really want to use this as an opportunity to understand what kind of impact it might have. In this case, we're collecting a lot of primary data in the form of surveys, in the form of just using the sort of the back end remittance transaction data from users. So, we're thinking about how we can bring together various forms of information to better understand the impact. And the idea, as you mentioned, is like to see to what extent this can be transferable in the long term. So, beyond Central America, could this be applied in the Horn of Africa or other contexts? But I think we wanted to start with a specific geographic scope, understand its impact before then trying to test it out in other places as well.
Great. Thank you for that. Have some follow-ups. So I'm gonna push us on to the audience. The first question I'm just gonna read because I'm not sure who the asker is. I'm gonna adjust a little bit about what could community-based data analysis or data informed decision making look like? And I guess the thing I'll tack on to that is, I think that there are potential sources from communities, potential data sources from communities that are valuable but overlooked. So if you could highlight those as well, that would be appreciated.
It's a great point. I was trying to allude to this a bit as well, because a lot of the research I presented, especially on the climate conflict analysis, was trying to use big data or to, use secondary data rather than really leveraging community-based data and information. So, as I mentioned, one of the caveats is that we are limited in our understanding if we only rely on those secondary sources. So I think where there's most potential is really like combining the two, because some of the bigger data, the secondary data, can allow us to look at a higher level. But we know a lot of times these issues are localized. So being able to then bridge that with more on ground information would be valuable. And I mean, I think for us, that often comes through our engagement with communities, interviews, discussions, focus group discussions, various forms of information gathering. But I think beyond collecting information, what the question was implying was also how can communities be engaged in the interpretation and the analysis of information. And I think that's something that we're also pushing towards, engaging more in sense making with communities that are affected by these shocks, because obviously they are the best place to really understand and know what's going on. So that is very much a priority, or something that we should be considering.
Great. Thank you. So the question is from Saber Noman, and the question is, I believe environmental impact can launch or be the real reason of a conflict in the near future, especially in places where water scarcity is evident. and then references Yemen, where some small-scale local conflicts have started already between tribes over water resources, even before the 9-year large-scale local and regional war took place in the country. So I was wondering, if you could speak to that a little bit, Beza.
I don't know the context that well, Yemen, but I can talk a bit about another context, the Sahel, where I've done a bit more work. And I think a similar observation that, there are often local drivers of conflict, and then there are, national political drivers as well. And I think it's what is interesting for me is seeing how these two things can become interconnected in some cases. I think at the local level, issues of resource scarcity and disputes over access to natural resources, particularly in agricultural dependent communities, is a big challenge in the context of climate change. And but those tensions often exist, have existed for a long time. When you add the additional pressure of, political disagreements and conflict at a higher level, I think then you see these issues becoming politicized, and also that they become kind of intractable conflicts in a sense. We've seen this a lot in the Sahel, where, community-based conflicts over resources are now kind of intersecting with the political and jihadist movements in the region. So there's a danger that, if we don't resolve the disputes that exist between communities over access to resources, they have the ability to be usurped or sort of politicized in these national level conflicts. I'm not sure if this is the case in Yemen, but there's that sort of dynamic between the local and the national political challenges in the Sahel.
Yeah, thanks for that. I'm going to add a little bit just from my perspective at USAID is that, and even my perspective in other contexts, is when you speak to folks on the ground about conflicts, often, they're dealing with multiple stressors at once, and those stressors tend to reinforce each other. And I think the question that the development sector has to wrestle with is not whether there'll be conflict related to resources. I think that's a clear risk, something that's ongoing and something that will get worse as the impacts of climate change ratchet up. But what tools do we have available to really make sure that these don't spiral out of control? And I think we've seen some success in programs that were able to, and Beza alluded to this, either leverage the environmental impacts to negotiate access and develop informal structures, or work through peace committees to identify ways, for example, now in the Horn, to deal with unprecedented drought. So I think that question was really great. And I agree that as things get worse, as the impacts of climate change get worse and more severe, the risks will grow with it. And I think the question becomes, what tools, not unlike the remittance example and not unlike some of the governance structures that Beza brought up, do we have available to leverage? So the next question I'm going to turn to is from Diego. I'm just going to go ahead and read it with an eye for time and making sure we get to all the others. Diego Osorio, and Diego asks about the framework of analysis. And are we, by pursuing causality, which I think I would push back a little bit on, I think this is more about understanding the contextual risks rather than the causal risks. Does that put us in the wrong track? And then asks, what about developing a new conceptual framework focused on complexity, which I agree with, network theory that relies more on a predictability angle that can emerge from big data and AI? As someone with limited background in big data and AI, I'm going to happily turn that over to you, Beza.
I mean, I think I agree with the gist of the comment. Yeah, I don't think we are pushing towards causality. I mean, that's been quite debated when it comes to this relationship between climate change and conflict. I think what was interesting and important for us to think about at Mercy Corps was, how can we respond? What are entry ways for us to design programmatic responses? And to be able to do that, I think we really wanted to better understand the dynamic. And that meant like the mechanisms, as we all know. And I mentioned, if this relationship is indirect, there's some kind of mechanism connecting climate climate factors and conflict. And yeah, I think that's why it was important for us to take some time to really test out, various hypotheses of the mechanisms and entry points for for responding, whether it was through governance or economic focused interventions or addressing like social cleavages, whatever it was. It just was helping us to be more prescriptive. Yeah, I mean, I agree with a complexity focused framework. I don't think I'm well placed to speak on that. So yeah, wouldn't, yeah, add much there. But I just think generally, yes, it's a very complex dynamic. We can't make simple linear, you know, connections between climate and conflict, but we should be pushing towards, finding solutions and ways of responding.
Yeah, thanks, Beza. And I agree. And I think the thing, how we frame this issue at AID is really how do these issues affect each other cyclically? Conflict is increasing with or without climate change, and that's going to hurt the governance structures and the infrastructure and the spectrum of underlying drivers of conflict or vulnerability to climate change to affect conflict. So I think thinking about that in that structure is really helpful. There's questions flying in, so I'm going to jump to the next one. Nazbul Khan asks an interesting question about how data sets can help any program support programs around mitigation from Mercy Corps. I'm going to quickly touch on that from an aid perspective of just noting that it tends to be this is more of an adaptation and resilience question for us. However, I think one thing about the mitigation piece is that, a lot of the work that aid does and other development sectors do focuses on carbon emissions that come from land. And I think managing land for mitigation comes with a set of conflict risks. So doing work to ensure conflict sensitivity around those programs is important, not only to be conflict sensitive, but to ensure the sustainability of that, what is effectively 1/3 of the world's carbon stores. So it's a really important question. Beza, I want to see if you have any reactions as well.
Unfortunately, I think our work at not unfortunately, but it's a fact that the work that we do and the research that we focused on is focused mostly on adaptation. I mean, this is primarily because the communities that we are working in, especially the fragile context, their most urgent need is adaptation. Of course, mitigation is a big part of the sort of the discussions around global climate action. But yeah, our concern primarily is with ensuring vulnerable communities that are impacted by climate change have the ability to adapt. And that's been the focus of our research. Yeah, I agree with you on the mitigation side. There implications on stability and conflict, perhaps with our approaches in terms of mitigation. So I would love to see more research on this, the sort of the conflict risks that we might be overlooking when we're working in that specific sector or that topic. But yeah, I don't have much to share as we don't have much research so far on this.
Yeah, thanks. And it's an important question. And just to underscore the notion that without robust global mitigation and shift away from fossil fuels is the dominant driver of the global economy, the risks of conflict get worse. So I'm glad to have had that question and glad that folks are thinking about that. So the next question I have is from Hector Morales Munoz, who asks, this one's for you, Beza. Have you identified potential risks stemming from unequal distribution of remittances that could lead to grievances conflict?
It's a great question. We haven't explored that risk, but it's something that we've thought about in terms of targeting. For example, who actually receives remittances? Are these the most vulnerable members of communities? Arguably, they are not because they have access to this additional source of income from a family member abroad. So oftentimes, they are better off than individuals that don't have a family member that can support them from abroad. We haven't really looked at the conflict dynamics. We did do some research on the ground with remittance recipients in Central America that focus more on their use of those resources and yeah, just the importance of remittances in their consumption and so on. But we haven't really talked to the non-remittance recipients. I think it would be interesting to also not forget about individuals that are left behind or that don't have this type of support and what the implications are there. So thank you. That's a very good point.
That's a great question. And I'm going to keep us pushing here. There's a quick question, or at least a pretty straightforward question from Dr. Jackson Kambari, who asks, what other sites would you suggest for usage similar to ACLED that could be useful in getting conflict data that can integrate easily with ArcGIS?
I think ACLED is what we've used the most because it's geocoded and we have specific, geo coordinates for ACLED data. Tala is also frequently mentioned, although I'm not quite as familiar with it. But those two tend to be the most prevalent, I would say. Yeah, I would, wouldn't add more to that at this point. I think perhaps at a national level, or looking at a specific, a community, there might be better conflict data as well. But if you're looking globally or across several countries, I think it would be ACLED or Uppsala.
Yeah, that's my understanding as well, that those two are the industry standard. And if folks have other ideas in the chat, I'm thinking about my close colleague, Rick Morgan here. Please feel free to put that in the chat. The next question that I have is about monitoring and evaluation. This is from Corey Kramer at Tetra Tech. And it asks, one of the longstanding questions we have had, sorry, I lost my spot here, is measuring impact of prevention and mitigation of conflict, and whether you can speak to the results of integrating climate data in conflict prevention programming. So, Beza, I'll turn that to you, and then I have a quick response to that.
hmm Yeah, this is something we are hoping to do and would like to do. Yeah, I think one interesting question is looking at some of our climate investments, adaptation investments, or things like natural resource management, and trying to test whether this has any kind of impact on preventing conflict. And there are approaches for doing that, impact evaluations that have, for example, control communities where, we intervene in these areas and we don't in these other areas, and we can sort of compare the outcomes, long-term outcomes, in different communities. So it's an important question. I think there's not a lot of data around examples of programs that have led to these outcomes, like prevention of conflict or reduction in conflict or improvements in, social cohesion and stability outcomes generally. And I think looking specifically at the climate investments or the sort of adaptation and things in that category would be a very valuable approach. Yeah. But I'm curious what you think, Daniel.
Yeah, I think it's an important question, and I'm going to make a shameless plug for I'll be on a panel as part of the upcoming PeaceCon event talking about this. And this was not my work, but there's some exciting new efforts around a toolkit for monitoring, evaluation, and learning around environmental peace building, which does touch upon climate questions as well. So just keep an eye out for that. And, I think that it's an important challenge because we're in a space where it's a lot of new types of interventions and a particularly thorny set of development challenges. So we don't have a ton of lessons to work for. And of course, we don't have that many counterfactuals. And I think in some respects, that's why that remittance example is so powerful, is that they were able to develop that experimentally. And there's not that many examples of that. And I think that trying to work through that challenge is going to take a field and far more than the 3 minutes we have left. So I'm going to run through the remainder questions real fast. The next one is, what is the nexus between government actions and inactions on the destruction of the environment, and how can this lead to conflict?
That's a great question. I think much can be said about this. Yeah, I mean, I will just say, in fragile context specifically, it's such a huge factor. I think, when we think about climate vulnerability and adaptive capacity, governance is such a big part of it. Communities that have poor governance in terms of institutions that can't really provide social safety nets for vulnerable individuals or communities that don't have functioning services or even reach in certain parts of their countries. This is a huge risk factor for not just conflict but vulnerability, right? In the context of climate change. So our research was trying to really get at this, like whether the improvement in governance or having strong governance institutions could help to this dynamic between climate vulnerability and conflict, and our findings were indicating that. But I think we didn't even really need the data. It's kind of intuitive in a sense that governance really matters when it comes to conflict, and also in terms of addressing climate vulnerability and helping communities be able to adapt.
Great. Thanks. So we are basically at time. I'm going to have to skip questions. I'm going to end with one last one. It's a very provocative one, and mostly it's going to be for us to think about. So I'm going to read the question, give a couple thoughts, turn it to Beza, and then back to Xander. And that Robin Fontaine asks, is evidence-based data analysis enough to unlock new sources of finance? And do you reckon forecast-based financing will be more prominent in the future? Is there enough evidence and basis to motivate, quote unquote, donors to fund conflict relief programs based on provisions? So I think it's a really powerful question. I don't know of any challenge that we're dealing with at USAID as a donor organization where we've said we have enough data, where that there's enough data to say that this is concrete, we're going to do it. I think ultimately there will never be enough, and there will always be complicated answers. But I think having a better sense of how and where and when these issues are going to overlap and intersect, I think enables us to be able to make a better case to, amongst others, the American people of why it is so important to be addressing climate change and conflict collectively. That these issues in a very globalized world are ultimately going to affect all of us in some form. So I think that an optimistic answer is straightforward is yes, but I think that there's a whole lot of complications to that. And then I'll let you take that, Beza, and then over to you, Sander.
I don't have much to add. My hope is yes, that having answers and generating evidence will lead to better decision making. But as you say, I think that's a bit optimistic. And there are many other factors that have led to challenges in terms of funding. But we hope that this will contribute to a better future.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Beza and Daniel, today, and for Mercy Corps and USAID for your support on the event today. For the audience, we'll have the recording to you hopefully within a week or so, along with all of the resources posted. You'll also get a link for a few discussion forums, an invitation to contribute content to ConnexUs, to the crowdsourced resource library, etc. But all in all, I can only say thank you so much to Beza, Daniel, and to all of our question askers today. I wish you all a great week. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, Xander, and thank you, Beza, for a wonderful talk.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.